Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, how can one spot grandiose narcissistic abuse in a relationship? So in order to answer this question, I'm making this video 10 signs of grandiose narcissistic abuse. And here in this example, I'll be focusing on a heterosexual romantic relationship where the man is narcissistic and the woman is the victim of narcissistic abuse. But of course we know this can also be the other way around. That's fairly common. And we also know that both people in a relationship can be narcissistic. One could have more of the narcissistic characteristics than the other person, but both people could still have some narcissism. So before I get too far into this, what is narcissistic abuse? And specifically, what is grandiose narcissistic abuse? Well, it's important to remember that there are two types of narcissism, grandiose and vulnerable, and both exist on a continuum. So it's not like somebody has grandiose or vulnerable narcissism or they don't. Everyone has some of the features of narcissism, but at different levels. And for a lot of people, the levels are so low, they don't interfere with functioning. But sometimes they get high enough to where they can interfere. We know that with narcissistic abuse, somebody can also have features of both grandiose and vulnerable characteristics at the same time. Now, focusing in on the grandiose component here, we know that when somebody has grandiose narcissistic features, and these are taken to an extreme, they could be diagnosed with a mental disorder called narcissistic personality disorder. This is a cluster B personality disorder, the dramatic erratic cluster, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, not everybody with extreme grandiose narcissistic characteristics would qualify for that diagnosis, but we see this sometimes. So when looking to define grandiose narcissism, I'm going to start with the personality disorder and then add some of the other characteristics we see associated with grandiose narcissism. So with the personality disorder, we see 9 symptom criteria: a grandiose sense of self-importance, having fantasies of success and power and wealth, being jealous of other people and believing other people are jealous of you. We see a sense of entitlement, arrogance, believing oneself to be special or unique, manipulating other people interpersonally, and this one, of course, is fairly important when we talk about narcissistic abuse. We see requiring excessive admiration and having a lack of empathy. So again, those are the symptom criteria, but then looking at some of the other characteristics associated with grandiose narcissism in general, we see low agreeableness, so somebody who's disagreeable, they tend not to trust other people. We see anger, aggression, a superficial charm, so being charming initially, but not having a lot of depth or substance. We see being callous, unemotional, socially bold or dominant, and being resistant to criticism. So now getting into the 10 signs or characteristics of grandiose narcissistic abuse. Now, some are the same as what we would see with vulnerable narcissistic abuse. Of course, there's some overlap. And it's important to remember that abuse that is not narcissistic could lead to these signs, and also mental disorders that have nothing to do with narcissism on both sides, meaning the person who's being abusive and the person who's the victim, could explain some of these too. So talking to a mental health clinician is always a good idea when somebody's trying to figure out if they're in a relationship that involves grandiose narcissistic abuse, or any type of abuse, really. So the first sign of grandiose narcissistic abuse is that the relationship appears strangled. And what I mean by this is not necessarily a lack of growth. I'll talk about that later on. That's another sign of grandiose narcissistic abuse. But like something external is just holding the relationship back and really preventing any type of freedom or movement in the relationship. So if there's this sense that the relationship is being strangled, that's a sign of grandiose narcissistic abuse. Number 2 is an abundance of immaturity. One thing we know about narcissism is it seems to be a situation that occurs when somebody gets stuck at a stage of development. So all people start out narcissistic, and most people shed the narcissistic characteristics as they learn to adapt to society and to society's norms. People that can't do that for whatever reason, because they were abused or other circumstances occurred, they get stuck in that narcissism. So they're immature. So really, by definition, if somebody has grandiose narcissism, they're going to be immature. And another kind of related sign to this one would be if you find yourself as the victim of narcissistic abuse, kind of resorting to petty tactics, kind of acting immature yourself, that is part of this immaturity sign. So it's immaturity on the part of the person who has narcissism, but it could also extend to the other party in the relationship, right? Sometimes what happens is when there's an immature person in a relationship, both people kind of get dragged down to that immature level, especially when arguments are occurring. The third sign of grandiose narcissistic abuse is when there's no forgiveness in the relationship. And this goes in both directions. Just because somebody is a narcissist doesn't mean that they're not mistreated as well, right? So we see that what happens in these relationships is neither person can forgive the other. So the relationships become hostile and cold, which really reflects the callous and unemotional characteristics we see with grandiose narcissism. The fourth sign of grandiose narcissistic abuse is there's no growth in the relationship. And this is similar to the relationship feeling strangled, but this is really when looking at the relationship over a long period of time. Really, relationships are supposed to grow and change and theoretically improve at some level. People get along better, they adapt to one another. But with narcissistic abuse, specifically grandiose, we see that the relationships kind of move backward. So they go for several years and maybe progress a little bit and then move backward. So there's no growth, or the relationships are actually kind of moving toward a worse place. They're moving, again, kind of backward toward the beginning. Now the fifth sign here would be that basic needs of the relationship are met, but more complex needs are not being met. So what we see is like food, shelter, financial security, transportation, and for that matter, sexual needs could be met, but the more complex needs are being sacrificed. Now when it comes to the sexual needs, though, a lot of times this is one way, meaning the grandiose narcissist has their sexual needs met, but the victim of the abuse does not have their needs met. So while on the topic of sex and needs being met, this leads to the sixth sign of grandiose narcissistic abuse, which is sexual narcissism. And what happens here in these relationships a lot of the time is that the person who's the victim of narcissistic abuse finds themselves submitting sexually, usually to prevent a fight or to prevent the narcissist from leaving the relationship. And this is typically subtle. It's not all at once. The narcissist kind of pushes slowly for increasing the number of sexual activities or becoming increasingly dominant, sadistic, or humiliating in the sexual component of the relationship. So it kind of maybe starts as innocent, like it may be fun, but then progresses to something that's really more abusive. So kind of in line with this particular sign is this idea that the victim is starved for any type of meaningful affection. So there's a lot of sexual activity, but it's not meaningful. There's no emotional connection, no sensitivity, and no depth. So this kind of goes back to the superficial nature of narcissism. So moving to the seventh sign of grandiose narcissistic abuse, this is kind of related to that emotional starvation component I mentioned before, but at an intellectual level. So being intellectually starved, not being intellectually stimulated. And there's a lot of different kind of signs of this. For example, parallel communication is something that's fairly common when there's no intellectual connection or intellectual stimulation. So this is when two people are talking to one another, but not really. So the narcissist will have their narrative and they'll say whatever they're going to say, and the victim will say whatever they're going to say, but they're not really connected. They're not building off of each other's narrative. So they're really just separate stories. If you heard them independently, you would get the same value as hearing them told together. That's parallel communication. And sometimes what I see here is that the victim will try to add something meaningful. They'll try to connect intellectually with the narcissist in the form of communication, but they'll be rejected. And I've heard this put in really unpleasant ways. For example, I've seen quite a few times when a couple is kind of talking to one another, but it's really more or less parallel communication, where the narcissist will say, please don't attempt to add anything to this conversation. So the victim will try to add something, and the narcissist will actually say that. So that's a very bad indication of grandiose narcissism, and of course it could be indicative of vulnerable narcissism as well. Moving to number 8 here, we see that there are certain emotional and affective signs that are associated with grandiose narcissistic abuse. Like when somebody's not encouraged or recognized and they have the sexual narcissism and the other characteristics, they tend to develop certain emotional and affective responses, like despondency, feeling worthless. Sometimes they're just told they're worthless by the narcissist. They might feel depressed or fatalistic. And by fatalistic, I don't mean like suicidal, but I mean like fatalism, like when somebody believes that their path is set out before them, that it's determined, like they have no control in their life. And that can happen because like the narcissist, especially a grandiose narcissist, has kind of taken control. We see other signs here wrapped up in the same one, the emotional affective signs, like being tired of fighting, feeling drained. I call this hate fatigue. So the victim might hate the narcissistic abuser a lot, but eventually they become tired of hating. Or the hatred turns inward, like self-hatred. So they might say to themselves, why do I put up with this narcissist? And they start to hate themselves for staying in the relationship. Sign number 9 for grandiose narcissistic abuse is when the victim starts to feel as though they are the problem. And this could be directly caused by gaslighting. So this is when the narcissist tries to convince the victim that they're the problem. But it could also be caused just by these other characteristics, these other signs of narcissistic abuse. So what we see is kind of a string of failed attempts to satisfy the demands of the narcissist. So this can affect self-esteem. And one of the worst signs I've seen, and I've seen this quite a few times, is when the narcissist gives the victim a list of things to change, like a physical list, or it could be digital as well, I guess. But I've seen it kind of written out many times. So they write out a list of things that the victim must change if the narcissist is going to stay in the relationship or come back to the relationship. So the narcissist could be having an affair and give this list to the victim and say, if you comply with this list, I'll think about coming back. Again, I've seen this several times, and I think this is one of the kind of more serious signs of narcissistic abuse, being handed a list and saying, you need to change all these things. Now that's different than a couple getting together and having certain things they want the other person to change. I'm talking about a one-sided list that's extensive and specifically paired with kind of this threat of leaving or this promise of coming back. So the last sign of narcissistic abuse, of grandiose narcissistic abuse, I'll cover here, sign number 10, is really involving the cognitive elements. So we see certain thoughts that tend to occur with people who are the victims of this type of abuse. They might be concerned that they're narcissistic too. They might worry about becoming narcissistic. They may be obsessed with revenge, like hoping that bad things happen to the grandiose narcissist. Not necessarily serious things, but I've seen that as well. A lot of times it's more of a passive desire. For example, I've seen situations where the victim has found out that the narcissist was in a car accident, but then they're disappointed to find out that the narcissist was fine. So they kind of get mad at the vehicle manufacturer for making the car so safe, or get mad at the person who caused the accident for not hitting the narcissist's car harder. Like things like that. So kind of bad thoughts, non-productive thoughts. And that's still, in a sense, passive. They're not actively doing anything to hurt the narcissist, but they're really hoping something bad will happen. So that's the 10th sign. Again, that's the cognitive piece that I've seen with grandiose narcissistic abuse. So I know whenever I talk about narcissistic abuse in any form, there are going to be a lot of different opinions. People have a lot of different examples of narcissistic abuse. If you agree or disagree with me or have opinions or examples, please put those in the comments. They always generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this video on the 10 signs of grandiose narcissistic abuse to be interesting. Thanks for watching.